Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. It's episode 345, and I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from the USA Today NFL Wire. As is normally the case, Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com is with us to discuss all things Cardinals related, but he comes from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, the SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. And this episode is a special one because it is our Senior Bowl review, and as we did last year, we have Justin Higdon, who is one of the co-hosts with Seth, so this is almost like an original draft breakdown podcast episode with me. So I'm just going to be kind of driving the conversation because in this episode of the show, we're going to be talking mostly about the Senior Bowl. Justin, glad to have you back on like we did last year a couple of times. It's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure. Like I love listening. This is the time of the year when I dive into your guys' podcast, which y'all who are listening should as well. It's the original Draft Breakdown podcast. There's a couple options for that. They got a free show each week, and then then you've got the different tiers. With $2 a month, you get their bonus show, and at $4 a month, you also get some written content as well. So if you guys are want to go in deep with the draft, this is the perfect time of year to do that and jump on board. Seth and Justin, how has the show been lately?
Oh, it's been great. Thanks for having me on again, guys. You know, it was this time last year that you guys had me on as a guest, and we kind of Seth and I kind of teased that we were coming back after a 3-year hiatus. We hadn't done the show, and then we brought it back. We picked up at show number 101, and now we're closing in on 50 new episodes of the free show, and then we've got another almost 50 episodes of the with the Patreon show. So almost 100 new episodes since we came back. So it's been a lot of fun. We usually record those early in the week. I had to push it back a little bit because you might hear that I've been a little under the weather this week, but we're powering through.
Good stuff. The first thing we want to talk about is not Senior Bowl related, and it is something that some of you probably think is nonsense, but we must discuss it some, Seth, and it is the issue of Kyler Murray and his Instagram and Twitter accounts, as after his Pro Bowl appearance, where he was probably the best player on the field, who had the best numbers out of all the quarterbacks through 3 touchdown passes, and also had the 2-point conversion toss to CeeDee Lamb, leaving Cardinals fans like my son Diego, who was stand for CeeDee Lamb all the way up to the draft, making them lament and wonder what could be if he were a Cardinal. That said, the news, if you want to call it news, is that after the game, he scrubbed his social media. So he left 2 pictures. So, we could say, we could frame it saying that he scrubbed his account, cleansed his account from all Cardinals references, but it was really like every reference of everyone, except for kind of his Heisman thank you, and then a gallery of photos from the Pro Bowl, which leads, because this is kind of the era we're living in. When you do something on social media, it might mean something, right? Seth, what's your thought on Kyler's social media gate thing that everyone's talking about, and either very worried or just mad about the fact that it's being talked about?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting to live in this era where, reporting on something somebody does in their personal life that has literally no effect is, a big thing. But two, I think it's interesting that it took this much time for people to find out that Kyler didn't like follow the Cardinals on social media in the first place. That was always interesting, right? Like, and then the fact that, yeah, I mean, I guess when you say he scrubbed the, and you know, it's you being the royal you, when you say he scrubbed them, you know, his social media of the Cardinals, like you said, he scrubbed his social media of everything, high school, college,
family, friends, the dog.
Yeah, family, friends, his dog, all of his Bruce Lee stuff that he's, you know, a big fan of, his jewelry, like scrubbed it of all of that. But you know what gets the juice flowing for fans, and like you said, in the negative and the positive is talking about it from a Cardinals perspective. I think there's a couple things that we can look at. One, Kyler's involved in some stuff outside of the Arizona Cardinals that may be coming up. You know, this is the Super Bowl weekend. There's a big game coming up, and he's part of a esports team that could be, you know, publishing something here. Again, you know, this is just speculation and stuff, just conversations. It could be something regarding his contract, but you know, when you look at it from that perspective, we know that the Cardinals tend to wait until the final year of a deal on a guy, and Kyler's got technically 2 years left on his deal. I mean, they haven't announced that
they will exercise the 5th-year option. There is no doubt about that at all. They just
right.
It'll happen before May.
And so, you know, it's not shocking that they haven't. So the fact that maybe they haven't negotiated, maybe that's something to it. I mean, honestly, for me, it's one of those situations where I just look at it and I don't really think too much about it. But it is, you know, interesting to have a conversation about and discuss when you look at the overall aspect of the roster and the team and, you know, and the reaction that it's grabbed, because it has grabbed a largely negative response from the fan base, which is, you know, fans basically saying, you know, at this point, either move on and you know, go find something else. And you know, we have a Browns fan on here. I mean, we're Cardinals fans, so we know how bad it is, but we have a Browns fan on here too. Like, quarterbacks like Kyler Murray don't grow on trees, and the fact of the matter is, you know, both of the franchises have been looking for quarterbacks for, since the Browns were reincepted into the NFL, and the Cardinals since they got to Arizona. And so, I mean, are you really? I mean, I guess that margin for Kyler is that razor thin for the fan base, for some of the fan base. I shouldn't say the whole fan base. You know, that they're just ready and willing to move on from him after offensive rookie of the year and 2 Pro Bowls and 1 playoff berth in 3 seasons.
Yeah, I all of this is so fun. No, I think the biggest deal of all, and it's just all the circumstances around it, and it's simply because bad end to the season, playoff loss, Kyler hates lose. Like Michael Bidwill is unhappy. There was talk though, all of that. Then he does that, and he's eligible for a contract extension, and he deleted those posts, which makes you think, oh wait, what if it's this? You know, if that's really what it is, like if this is related to being unhappy with the team for his contract or whatnot, we'll hear about it another way. But this, for me, is just a sort of a data point, like, okay, raise concern, something that, you know, as writers, like, and I wrote about it, and, you know, I'll be honest, like I took some heat from a lot of fans for writing it's not a story and suggesting this and not. And but the traffic that got, the clicks that it got, suggested that people were thinking about it. So for me, I'm not worried yet. And honestly, even if he's unhappy about his contract, I'm not worried, because what we've seen that with so many players is that they're unhappy until they get the deal. So even if if he wants his money now and the Cardinals don't get it to him and they wait till next offseason, he'll be unhappy for a year, and then when he gets his money, he'll be fine. That's kind of my take on the whole thing. Once that contract extension happens, it won't matter. It's just a matter of how much angst there is around it. But I mean, what can you expect? I would get the Cardinals for not extending him now, because there is precedent. There is precedence with it with Josh Allen, but there was a difference, is that Allen, in that year 3 took them nearly to the Super Bowl, and Kyler quite hasn't done that yet.
Well, and I mean, you also have the precedent on the other side where, Lamar Jackson had a better individual season in his third year, won the MVP, and they haven't given him a massive extension yet, right? Like,
Nope, not yet.
So I mean, you've got the Mahomes and the Allen side of things, and then you've got the Lamar and Baker side of things. So I mean, everything, and so all of those things fall into that, like you said, into that data, and you just have to kind of decide where Kyler falls into it. And I mean, the reality of the situation is, as a franchise, you have to look at it from the perspective of, you are the Arizona Cardinals, and the best quarterbacks you've ever had outside of Kyler Murray are guys you got off the trash heap. I mean, there were reclamation projects that just happened to fit into the system and, and play at a high level. It's not like they've ever drafted and groomed one. So, I mean, the first one that you have drafted and began to groom, if you're really willing to give up on that after 3 seasons, that's going to be, that's just going to be an interesting thing, because like we talked about with Cliff, you're setting the bar, extremely high, because if the next guy comes in 3 seasons, doesn't have 2 Pro Bowls, it's time to move on, right? Like, you can't extend him then. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I tend to think it's, we're talking about and speculating, because it's just, there's nothing else to talk about in the realm of Cardinals stuff, outside of the 900 different mock drafts that you're seeing.
Exactly. And with that, we'll close the book on that situation unless it comes up later on. But coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we're going to talk about the Senior Bowl. Specifically, we're going to go kind of position group by position group and talk about the standouts, maybe guys who disappointed a little bit, or those who, we were expecting something from them and they showed it. We won't necessarily go Cardinals specific, but this is where I'll kind of be talking less. It'll be a lot more Seth and Justin. So this is where it becomes where I'm sort of a guest on the original Draft Breakdown podcast. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. You're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We've got the Senior Bowl that happened this last week. Obviously, analysts, and evaluators more than anything, they look partially at the game and a lot at the practices, and now we know that last year the Senior Bowl was incredibly important because of the pandemic year, and it was one of the few times that you actually got in-person, sort of evaluation. And we know some teams, the Cardinals are one of those teams that does tend to put decent stock into the Senior Bowl performance, because especially if you're not from a top tier program, or your competition is at all questionable, you get to see these players competing against the best, at least the best seniors, obviously. So let's start that off. Seth and Justin, tell us about just your overall take on this year's Senior Bowl. What were your thoughts overall on the talent overall, how it went, and kind of what we can expect moving forward in the draft process?
Yeah, guys. Overall, I thought my takeaways were that we're seeing a really deep tight end class this year without a real like first round type of tight end. But if you looked at the rosters across not just the Senior Bowl, but also the Shrine Bowl and even the NFLPA Bowl, those are basically your three big college all-star games. You saw a lot of draftable tight ends. And so starting on day 2 and going throughout the rest of the draft, you're going to have some players that are going to stick in the league for a while. I think you got another good receiver class, and we haven't even seen the underclassmen yet. So we're just based on the seniors that have played in the Senior Bowl and some of these other all-star games, it's shaping up to be another receiver class. But it's important to remember after watching these games that there's another 70-plus underclassmen, plus a lot of seniors who didn't participate in the Senior Bowl that we haven't seen yet that are going to be in the draft as well. So that's something I caution people to avoid the hyperbole that comes out of this. You got some strong offensive linemen, but I'm not sure, in my opinion, they're as strong as what you're seeing in mock drafts. And I think the strength's going to be more in the interior offensive line. And one of the things that I thought elevated both the Senior Bowl and the Shrine Bowl is something that Seth and I caught on to over the summer. The Shrine Bowl is coming for the Senior Bowl in terms of some of these prospects. So the two events became competitive with each other. The Senior Bowl came out on top with the top prospects again, but you still saw a lot of good talent actually participate and play in the Shrine Bowl. And I think they're going to see an uptick in the number of players from that game and from that event drafted. And over time, that location in Las Vegas or wherever it might be when if they're following the Pro Bowl around, that's going to draw more people. So I think those two games being competitive was good for everybody as far as the games themselves and the scouting community.
Yeah, and even though this is not Cardinal centric, I tend to look through everything through that lens. And one of the things I looked at just for us as Cardinals fans is this is a good draft to have need on the interior of the offensive line. As Justin said, the strength, there's a lot of guys being mocked in the first round that are tackles that probably project better to playing interior. But there's also a lot of really talented interior offensive linemen. I think we saw that this week. Justin talked about the wide receiver class, and that's one of the things that I've seen that's fairly deep and that, again, exciting as a Cardinals fan when you look at the needs of this team and how they fit, because there are some receivers that fit in that role that they need, to improve on what AJ Green brought to this team, right? And so you look at it and you say, hey, you can get a big, Z receiver on the outside opposite DeAndre Hopkins, and you can probably get him on day 2. And then the final thing that I saw was that it goes back to kind of what you and I talked about in the first segment. You really need to be careful what you wish for or expect when you look at the quarterbacks, because this is a perfect example of this quarterback class is being touted as decent by some, but the reality is there just doesn't seem to be a lot out there. Every guy has big question marks in, and that's going from Pickett, who has baby hands, to Malik Willis, who looks like the reincarnate of Josh Allen throwing the ball, where sometimes he makes a throw and you're like, dude, this guy has it, and then he throws a 10-yard out and you're like, why were you throwing the ball into the stands there? Like, what were you doing? And so, I mean, and then you've got guys like Bailey Zappi, who, I'm pretty sure Justin yourself and I could all roll out and probably throw the ball as well as he does, just from an arm talent standpoint. So, there's a lot of different conversations and interesting aspects that came from the Senior Bowl, but the Cardinals' needs this year line up pretty well with the strengths of the draft, which is always nice when you have it fall that way.
So let's talk about the quarterbacks. We'll look at the quarterbacks and the running backs to start. Who were the quarterbacks that helped themselves, if at all? Who showed that maybe didn't help themselves? I don't want to necessarily call it disappointment, but perhaps didn't help themselves. And who were the guys that kind of showed who they were?
I think Seth kind of touched on it. Malik Willis has all the physical tools that you want. He's got the strongest arm there. The ball really jumps out of his hand. He's got athleticism. He's some people say he's going to run about a 4.5. Some people say it'll be sub 4.5. Either way, it's going to be fast because he's about 6 foot and 220 pounds. So the measurables, height is not ideal, but it's over 6 feet. So people are tending to overlook that these days. Hand size and all that was all fine. But I just am not that high on the quarterback class on the whole. So, if I have to pick a winner, it's him, but he was already, I think, the best quarterback prospect coming in just from a physical standpoint, because the other quarterbacks that participated, they just have, I think, too many flaws in their game to make them even potential first-round picks. So it's and to watch the practices, if you watched them on ESPN, you would think that these quarterbacks are, first-round quality players. And then you'll see somebody like Benjamin Albright. He's tweeting that there are going to be 4 quarterbacks in the first round, and that if you want to draft Malik Willis, you're going to have to get up to 5 overall or something like that. And it all feels to me like like they're chasing the dragon this year, because I don't think it's there. It's like Mean Girls. You stop trying to make fetch happen. I don't understand why we can't just call it like it is. It's not a good quarterback class, especially considering the last couple of classes where you've had players at the top that actually, had a lot of the physical attributes that you want and had the college success. Seth mentioned Kenny Pickett and the hand size, and that became kind of a joke. But
because he refused to be measured, right?
Yeah, he shows up, and people are kind of joking. Hand size doesn't matter. This it's stupid. And then he shows up and he doesn't get his hands measured. So then he comes out and says, I've got double jointed thumbs. We're working on some physical therapy to stretch out so they can measure my hand flat on a surface. And then day 2 happens, day 2 of practice, and there's terrible weather in Mobile. It's raining. There's a lot of wind. And so that's what people are concerned about when they're talking about his hand size, which I think is a little bit overblown, because how often are there these terrible weather games? They don't happen that often. But here we have him, horrible weather, day 2, and his throws are wobbling, and he's mishandling snaps. It's like his worst nightmare happened on day 2. So day 3, they're playing inside. I think the broadcast crew of ESPN's trying to smooth things over for him.
They were really, really complimentary of Pickett during the game.
Yeah, I saw that too. And but I think if you're a scout, if you're a coach, if you're in that scenario and you're worried about the hand size at all, and then you see day 2 in person, you have to be like completely off of him. If you see a list of quarterbacks with 9-inch or smaller hands, the best ones are going to be Joe Burrow, okay? And then the next best one's probably going to be Jared Goff. So, I mean, you see how Burrow could be the outlier there, and you don't necessarily want to bet on that. And the other guy I'll mention is Carson Strong, because a lot of the draft nicks, and Seth and I have talked about it on our show throughout the year, have been high on Strong. We haven't been high on Carson Strong. And I think you saw in these conditions, and even when the weather wasn't terrible, that Carson Strong maybe doesn't have as big of an arm as people tried to sell to during the regular season. So nobody, Seth said Zappe. I don't think Zappe would normally be a Senior Bowl quarterback, but when a guy throws for 6,000 yards, and
you kind of have to have him there.
You want to take a look at him, right? But he would have been the type of player back in the day that would have been at the Shrine Bowl in St. Pete back when it was in Florida, and then maybe got a call up if he played well that week. But he didn't really stand out to me at all.
Yeah, when you look at the quarterbacks, I mean, it again comes back to my point of like every year is different, and like unless you're prepared and have something in the works, like moving on or even not extending the quarterbacks you have, you better have a good reason for it. And so, when you look at it from the Cardinals' perspective, it's tough because they have done well enough where they're now drafting in the lower portion of the first round. And then you look at the talent. I mean, Desmond Ridder basically showed that he really isn't a guy that's gonna come out and really throw the ball all over the field, right? Like Willis is a guy that and I know they wouldn't do this, but like if you're the Browns and you're going to move on from Baker, Willis is a guy you could grab and kind of give him a year.
Is he more? I get the vibe kind of like a Trey Lance.
I don't. Sure, I could see that because I didn't think Lance was a player that you'd want to pick third overall. But if you have the luxury, I guess, of making the playoffs, I won't even say going as far as San Francisco did, but just making the playoffs possibly without him, then maybe you can take that time. But it's kind of like Willis is like that. If you must take a quarterback in the first round, probably take the guy with the best physical skill set and hope that you can work with him. One of the things Seth and I talk about with QBs is they better have some like athletic traits, some mobility, some escapability, so that when they are trying to pick up the speed of the NFL game, they can still make plays and run and pick up some yards that way. You saw it with Justin Fields this year, where when the Bears first game they played with him, they tried to keep him in that pocket, and the Browns sacked him 9 times. Once they let him kind of make some more one read and run type of plays. Josh Allen, you saw them do that with him early in his career with the Bills. If a team can do that, then Willis is your guy because there's nobody else in this draft that's like that. So Seth and I've told Seth I think Kenny Pickett's going to be the first one picked. I might be waffling on that after seeing the second day of practices, but also we can't be too hard on a guy in such terrible conditions. So there still could be somebody fall in love with him and go in the top 10, but I think it would just be a mistake.
What about the running backs? Being a Sun Devil fan, the one guy that stood out for me is the guy that I normally would be watching, that's Rachaad White, who kind of showed to me, I don't know during the practice, I didn't watch any of those, but during the game, showed kind of the same thing he did when he played during the regular season for the Sun Devils, that he's got a little promise. But I've been disappointed by lots of running backs from ASU before. Is there anything different about this guy other than the size? In the skill set, is there something different about him than the Marion Grices or the DJ Fosters, the Benjamins of the world?
Yeah, I mean, he's got some burst and some speed, and you saw it on display in the game. But the one thing you always have to keep in mind with the Senior Bowl and other All-Star games, first of all, they're never going to have the top running backs in the class because the top running backs in the class are always going to be underclassmen. True. So you are watching
the White, I believe, if I recall, he is. He's a graduate, but he was a graduate, and so he technically is under. He's He's an underclassman who graduated, so he got to go to the Senior Bowl.
Right. We saw another guy like that, Jerome Ford. He was there for the first day of practice. But the stars of this class are going to be Breece Hall, Isaiah Spiller, Kenneth Walker. None of them are there. The other thing about these all-star games is they're just not great showcases for running backs, and in my opinion, linebacker. So you like to see – I personally like to see what they do in the games at those positions, because I think they have you can get a better read on how they're playing. And so with that being said, I think that White had a good game, as good a game as any running back in this game. So, I mean, his receiving ability and then his athleticism, his speed, his long speed is kind of what sets him apart, in addition to being a bigger back to some of these other past ASU backs. So I think teams are going to be looking at him maybe in the 4th round, and it's going to come down, as it often does, to combine testing. Say he runs faster than expected, that's going to give him a little boost. But, I thought the best running back there was Brian Robinson from Bama. And this is a player who's, he was a backup. He was a rotational guy for 4 years at Bama. And then he comes back for a 5th year because he gets the extra year of eligibility. He becomes the lead dog. He has a great 1,000-yard season. Bama goes far. He shows off some receiving chops, and he's probably the best pass protecting running back in the class. And still, I think he's probably going he's going to get the Bama attacks. So let's say 3rd round. He's probably still a 4th round type of player.
Yeah, the guy that maybe stood out the most this week, or that you saw more from than what you were used to, is the Florida running back, Damian Pierce. Somebody we highlighted on the original Draft Breakdown podcast. Nice job, Justin.
And we had to see more of him because he barely played at Florida.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. He's an interesting one when you talk about running backs, because in his career, Jess, he has 329 carries.
What?
In his career.
Fresh legs.
So you have a guy like Robinson who has...
Wait, he was the guy that changed from linebacker, wasn't he?
No, he played running.
No, that was Abram Smith for Baylor.
Yeah. No, Pierce played running back all 4 years at Florida. They used him this year, or they used him more as like a change of pace back. But I mean, he came in at 5'10" and over 210 pounds. So it's not like he's a small guy by any means. This year was his best year at Florida. I mean, he had only 100 carries for 574 yards, but he had 13 rushing touchdowns and 3 receiving touchdowns. So, on the season, he had 790 yards from scrimmage, but 16 touchdowns. And remember, that Florida offense wasn't very good this year. So, he's a really intriguing guy because, like Justin said, he's kind of in the same boat as Brian Robinson, just not on a good team, right? You wonder what he could have looked like as a 5th-year guy, getting that extra boost and everything. But for the most part, man, I mean, this running back class is, like Justin said, it's going to be heavy with underclassmen. But those Senior Bowl guys were all right around, late round 3, but they're mostly day 3 guys. I think Robinson, to Justin's point, and then maybe a guy like Pierce, depending on how he tests, because of that nose for the end zone type thing, and the fact that he played on a terrible Florida team this year. It'll be interesting to see where he goes.
And just real quick to go mention Abram Smith from Baylor. He had a big year this year. I think he had 1,400 yards rushing, but he had the smallest hands, under 8-inch hands, and it kind of showed up in the practice. He was dropping passes. He didn't seem to have the greatest ball handling skills. And the other thing was Smith, I thought he just kind of looked unnatural as a running back. So I think we don't want to put too much stock into his yardage total in 1 year. Like Jess said, he was a linebacker in 2020, and he was kind of pressed into service as a running back this year. Had a great year in college, but this is a player who spent 3 years at Baylor not playing running back, or at least not extensively. He had been playing special teams and defense. So you want to with a player like that, I think you want to caution yourself. Ask yourself why he wasn't playing running back earlier, and then look at some of the measurables, and you're going to see that it's just not an ideal fit. You're looking at a day 3 player there.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on to the next group. Let's talk about the receivers and the tight ends. If you were listening earlier, Seth and Justin both said that's a strong class. There's some players to pay attention to. That's coming up next on the Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on and talk about the wide receivers and the tight ends, the pass catchers from the Senior Bowl. Who stood out the most at both? Let's start with receivers. Who stood out most with the receivers during the weekend in the game?
I think most people are going to say Christian Watson from North Dakota State. He was getting so much hype that we saw on Saturday, I think it was. Brett Coleman, who makes a lot of YouTube videos, does some draft work each year. He was basically saying, even if you think Watson is a first-round prospect, you're not high enough on him. I think that's insane hype. Watson he's not old, but he'll be 23 years old. He is a senior coming out of the FCS. And I think you have to put it in perspective. You look at a player like, I'll use Nico Collins as an example because he came out of Michigan. He's about the same build and expected to have about the same kind of testing as Christian Watson. And he went, I think, 67th overall to the Houston Texans. Had a pretty decent rookie year at times. Watson definitely helped put his name on the map, but I think NFL teams are not as high on him as the media. A guy that Seth and I talked about last week on our shows, I think both of our shows, was Calvin Austin from Memphis. And this is a player I think he will be higher on NFL teams' boards than maybe the media is realizing right now because he is tiny. He's 5'7", 173, but he is going to run a 4.3, and some people even say he might run a sub 4.3. He was beating everybody. Nobody could cover him in practice. He only had one catch, I think, in the game, but there was just nobody that could run with him. And if he does run a sub 4.3, he'll go in the top 50.
Yeah, and then, again, when you look at those guys in this class, it really fits into what the Cardinals need, as we talked about. He mentioned Watson. At his size, there's murmurs that he's going to be a sub 4.45 guy, which would be absurd. Then you're talking about unique skills for a player of that size, because he measured in at what, 6'4", 215-ish?
Yeah, right. He's right around there.
And then, so, if he's a sub 4.45 guy, it's going to be an impressive feat. But, the guy that I thought stood out all week and basically just did what he's been doing his whole career was Jalen Tolbert of South Alabama. Now, I think the biggest loss for Tolbert on this whole thing was that his measurement came back 2 inches shorter and about 5 pounds lighter than what he was listed at South Alabama, which is unfortunate, but it's also one of the things that you all have to be careful with when you talk about, college measurements of guys, because they tend to be off on those guys.
And he's still over 6'1". He's still like 6'1 and a quarter. So he's not short.
Right. And, everybody was like, oh, he's going to be 6'3", and which is, let's be honest, 6'3" versus 6'1" at a receiver is a huge difference. And I had actually compared him to, kind of like an AJ Green type who measured in at 6'3", and I think, 215 back in 2011. So, but Tolbert all week showed off that he's got, fantastic speed. He's great going up and getting contested catches, and he's a guy that can make plays with the ball in the air. And so that's what you want in a receiver, and that's what he showed all week. And of course, we get the mock draft overreaction from the Senior Bowl. And so now you're seeing him in some mock drafts in round 1, which is, Justin and I have talked about him literally since last year, for the 2022 draft. So we're huge fans. That's absurd. right?
Yeah, I think it's the Senior Bowl recency bias because again, like you can put Watson in a top 15, but I mentioned Nico Collins. He's 6'4", 215, and ran a 4.45. That sounds about right for Watson. Watson's coming from the FCS, and Nico Collins goes 67 overall. Why is Christian Watson going to go 2 full rounds ahead of a guy like Nico Collins who went to Michigan and who has some big time game tape against a team like Ohio State? Then with Tolbert, you're talking about a player who had a 1,000+ yards as a junior in 2020 in the Sun Belt where they played all their games. They didn't have a shortened season in 2020, unlike a lot of conferences, but he still didn't declare, which indicates that the NFL didn't think he was a first rounder last year. Now he's got more competition. You watched some of these guys comment on the Senior Bowl, and they have completely forgotten that you've got Traylon Burks, that you've got Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave coming out of Ohio State. Some of these other, Jahan Dotson, who was initially on the Senior Bowl roster, but who ended up not playing there. All of these players coming from Power 5 conferences that are underclassmen or seniors who didn't participate, who had big-time seasons. Like, how many receivers are we putting in the first round of the mock? 9? I mean, that's not going to happen.
What about the tight end group? You said this is a strong tight end. Well, actually, who are the receivers that didn't help themselves?
I only have one guy who I thought didn't help himself. There are several guys who I think are just kind of average, middle tier players who didn't do anything to hurt or harm them, or to hurt or help themselves. But I thought Dontario Drummond from Ole Miss had a rough week, and he had some drops. He had some problems against some of the DBs getting loose. And Seth and I mentioned him I believe on the weigh-in show last week on the original Draft Breakdown podcast. He's built like Deebo Samuel. He's like a running back build playing wide receiver, and you can play him out of the slot. He had a great season for Ole Miss, but he just didn't have a good week. And you don't see that kind of, he showed dynamic run after the catch ability at times at Ole Miss, but he didn't play well in this setting. And he's an older prospect. He's actually going to turn 25 before next season. So you add a flag like that to, kind of unimpressive Senior Bowl. He's going to have to really test well, but I think you're still looking now at a very late round prospect in Drummond. And it's a shame because I think he could have really helped himself if he had been able to show that he can separate in the open field.
A couple guys that just, they didn't make a name for themselves, but they just kind of either solidified what we thought about them, or showed that they belong. I thought Alec Pierce was good all week, and I never really had any questions about him. He's another guy when I talk about that Z fit for the Cardinals. He's the guy that makes sense. I thought that Khalil Shakir showed off a lot of what we liked about him at Boise State. He's a good fit, a good player. I think people that hadn't seen him were surprised more. And I saw a lot of people talking about Shakir, like they were surprised how athletic and how well he played. And I was just more like, well, I mean, he played at Boise State, and it's not like they had, he had Joe Burrow or the kid at Ohio State or Alabama, Bryce Young throwing to him. Like, it's hard sometimes to play at those other schools, and then have to make plays. But I thought Shakir and Pierce both, kind of showed why they're top 100 prospects in this draft.
I think Pierce was okay. I think he's going to be, of those two players, I think he'll be drafted higher because he's over 6. I think he's 6'2" and about 215. He's a former volleyball player. He's going to have a 40-inch vertical. he'll have a better 40 time than Shakir as well. I think Shakir is kind of going to be pigeonholed as a slot receiver because he's got really short arms. He's about 6 foot even, but you don't see the type of, contested catch build that's going to beat corners. You have a lot of 5'11" corners in this league, so a 6 foot guy with short arms isn't going to out jump a lot of those guys. A 6'4" guy is going to, and so he doesn't have to run as well. Or even a short guy like Calvin Austin, who's 5'7" but has close to a 40-inch vertical. He could beat those guys. But that's where I think Shakir's limited, and he's going to be a slot. And these are two players where I think, again, you have to watch them and say, don't forget there's all these juniors that we haven't seen yet.
Tight ends. It's a strong class. Any first-round talent, guys?
I would say no.
I think the kid from Colorado State's going to be on the bubble. I thought he showed that, and I'm talking about Trey McBride. Sorry, the first name was escaping me at that time. Trey McBride. I thought that he showed the requisite nastiness that you would want to see from a tight end. So he wasn't just a guy that is going to be making a bunch of catches. He's a guy that can go in line and block as well, which I thought was important for him in this week. But he's the only one, and he's probably going to end up probably more like top 40 than top 32.
And I'm going to go in a little bit different direction and sticking with McBride, because McBride was the player that Seth and I named our tight end of the year on one of our shows. However, Trey McBride was listed at 6'4", 260 in the Mountain West, and he actually measured in at 6'3" and 249 pounds. Now, one thing that we saw out of him consistently, like Seth said, he's got physicality, he's got nastiness to him, and he can beat some of these safeties on these contested balls. But he's bigger than the safeties, right? But he's not that big for an NFL tight end. So I think at 6'3", 249, you're almost looking at H-back size, because he's not 6'3" and a half. He's right at 6'3". He doesn't have really long arms. He's just kind of average build. And now you've got a Mountain West player, a 4-year player, not a guy who is athletic enough to declare early, and he comes in a little bit undersized of what you think. So the broadcast crew for ESPN, they were still on board with him, but you could see their eyes were drifting to some of these other tight ends in the class, because I think subconsciously they're disappointed that McBride didn't come in bigger, and I think that's going to hurt his stock. I don't think he's going to go top 40. I actually think he might be maybe the 3rd or 4th tight end picked.
The rest of the class, I mean, it was a good class. I've talked about Charlie Kohler quite a bit. Was he held back by Bryce Petty or Brock Purdy? Sorry, same difference, right? I don't think there's any different. I thought Jeremy Ruckert showed out to be the most consistent tight end.
I thought Ruckert looked the best of any tight end as far as a prospect in practice. He didn't play in the game, I don't think.
No,
he's 6'5", 250, and he was getting open every time, and you see how much he was underused at Ohio State.
And then I thought Jake Ferguson had a good week.
He had a really good game too.
He's a guy that you know what you're going to get from him, right? He's a Wisconsin tight end. I think he offers a little more in the passing game than you would expect. I'm really interested to see what he times at, because he's not quite. I mean, did he come in at 6'5", 245?
I think he's a little bit shorter. I think he came in a little smaller than expected too.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. He's going to have to move a little better, because while he was used a lot in the run game, you're going to have to see he's going to be a little smaller. I think the concerns that you and I have talked about with the kid from Coastal Carolina, Isaiah Likely, I think those kind of showed up. Not that, again, that he hurt himself in any way, but the warts of his game, so to speak, were a little more pronounced.
The broadcaster, I mean, Todd McShay loved him, and he was saying he's going to be his number 2 tight end. I think that's a little wild. That's something he's going to regret to say, but I regret saying. But I don't think, with a guy who's high profile like McShay, they're allowed to change their rankings a lot because the rankings are fluid. But likely, to me, he looked like a group of 5 tight end playing in that setting, where he was inconsistent catching the ball. I don't think he's a great blocker. I think he's more of a project than what they were letting up. Like, he's going to be athletic, but so are a lot of these guys. I think Jake Ferguson actually is going to run well because he ran 4.7 out of high school, and Wisconsin has a pretty good strength program. So I think Ferguson will actually run pretty well. He showed some run after the catch ability in that game. And I was wrong. He was over 6'4", and 3/8 and 244 pounds.
Okay, so he was about right where he was measured. Okay, that's why I was curious because he's going to have to. But I mean, you look at Likely. He's a little bigger, but like he reminds me kind of like Delaney Walker type.
So, another H-back kind of type.
Right, like a guy that's best work is going to be done as a move tight end, like similar to what the Cardinals did with Zach Ertz. Like if you've got a Max Williams already and you don't need him to be your main blocking tight end, then I think you're fine. But if you're going to ask him to block consistently, you could be in some trouble. So, that's how I would look at like an Isaiah Likely. And again, that's not like, I don't think there was anybody that was exposed, so to speak, this week where you're like, oh man, they're just not very good.
No, I don't think so either.
Which is saying something, because usually at the Senior Bowl, there are like 3 or 4 guys you're like, what on earth were they thinking bringing that guy here?
Right, and I don't think they could. So I think in the past they've kind of dabbled like that because they were players that the NFL scouts wanted to see. But this year, those players were able to still go to the Shrine Game or the NFLPA Bowl and get that same kind of tryout. So in the past, I think especially the last couple of years, the Senior Bowl was bringing guys in that you're like, why is this guy here? He should be in one of the lower level games. And this year, they were able to find those fits better.
How about we talk about, so coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the next group. We'll talk about the big guys, the guys in the trenches, the offensive line, and the defensive interior. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. We move on to the offensive line and the defensive interior. Who were the Senior Bowl standouts on the line? And Seth mentioned, I think it was Seth who mentioned that it's more the interior guys that impressed.
To me, the most impressive offensive lineman, regardless of position, was Zion Johnson from Boston College. And he's a guard, but they also were keeping him after practice to practice snapping, because he's under 6'3", so you might see him go to center in the NFL. So it's always a transition. A guy hasn't played center, but we saw them do this with Quinn Miners last year, who was playing. He had played tackle, I think, at Wisconsin Whitewater, and they taught him how to play center, and so he's a guard center. So that's Johnson he had the best anchor of any offensive lineman that I saw. And he was going against the biggest guys because he was going against the interior defensive linemen. And he just really looked like a player who can hold his own. He's very stout, very strong. So we know we don't have to worry so much about NFL combine testing if we're going to have a guy inside at guard or center. And, maybe if you run more zone, you're going to want a guy with lateral agility. So you want to keep an eye on those numbers, but you don't have to worry so much about the 40 time and the vertical jumps and things like that. You don't need that that explosiveness as much. You want that strength, that stoutness. And Zion Johnson, it shows up on Boston College tape. It showed up in practice. I think, it's hard for me to really follow offensive linemen during the game when I'm watching the game in real time, but I think he did just fine. He had a great week.
Another guy that was really good was Trevor Penning out of Northern Iowa. This wasn't surprising for Justin and I because, as we've talked about, if you listen to the podcast, Northern Iowa is maybe one of the top 3 strength and conditioning programs, or strength training programs in the country. Even though they're are they a D1 now, or are they still FCS?
They're FCS still.
Yeah, so even though they're still FCS, they turn out studs. I mean, we can go back to David Johnson, coming out of there with his numbers. Like they just straight up turn out guys who are athletic freaks. So
they had Spencer Brown just last year coming out.
Yeah. And then, Penning this year. So it's interesting to see the whole dynamic of them come in. Penning is going to be interesting because he's played left tackle. That's not surprising. We've talked about it on the show before, Justin. Left tackles in college are usually the best offensive linemen, especially at smaller schools. So if you're drafting a left tackle from like a Northern Iowa, that's the best offensive lineman at Northern Iowa. But he probably projects more to a right tackle, or even though he is 6'7", maybe a guard. Here's what I'll say about both Penning and Zion Johnson. They both are physically dominant, but they go about it in a lot of different ways. Penning is, I'm trying to think of like a John Runyon type, right? Like a borderline dirty.
Yeah, I was thinking Richie Incognito.
Yeah.
Who was a very, very good lineman for a long time.
Yeah.
Right. And so you're okay with it when he's on your team, right? You're like, oh yeah, I love this guy. But
yeah, so I mean, I thought he was kind of over the top in the practice. You're in practice with your peers, your fellow seniors. You're all trying to get drafted, and he's giving people the business when they're on the ground. And at this stage in the game, I appreciate that you play with an edge, but then once the guy's on the ground and you're still messing with him, it's not the same as being in a game. You're at an all-star game. So people took exception to that. And maybe it seems like I'm being nitpicky, but if you look at this guy, he has a track record of drawing penalties. And I think the stat was he drew 38 penalties in his career. That's a lot of penalties. And if you have a left tackle that's drawing 10 penalties a year, that's going to be annoying to not just the guys who he's roughing up after the whistle, but also to you, your coaching staff, your teammates, and things like that.
A couple of other guys that played well all weekend, or all week. I always forget it's not during the weekend. I thought Darian Kennard was a good ball player. We weren't overly shocked about that because our guy Sully has talked about him a little bit. Dylan Parham came in a little heavier than we were expecting, which was good for him because he played in the 280s. Now that's a concern, but they had him working out at center, and it was interesting to see him work out at center because it almost played to his strength. Being able, because of how quick he is, being able to snap the ball and then use his leverage against the bigger guys. I thought he had a nice week as well.
Yeah, there was a player from UTSA from Texas San Antonio, Spencer Burford, and I don't think he had the greatest week, but he is an athletic guy with long arms, and so I think he's a player who you can put at guard and who's going to be a solid, like, developmental day 3 guy that you can have, and he's going to have some versatility because I think he played tackle at UTSA, and if he's with those long arms, you can put him there even though he's only about 6'3". I'm going to throw out 2 guys from the Shrine Bowl. just throw him out there to keep your eyes on day 3. That's LSU's Austin Deculus. He was a right tackle. He's athletic enough and big enough to either play right tackle or move inside to guard. And then there's another North Dakota State product, Cordell Volson, who I believe he was a tackle for them, but he's another player I expect to be athletic enough to play right tackle or guard. Those two guys really stood out to me during the Shrine Bowl game itself. They were just beating everybody up in the run game.
Did anyone disappoint?
I was slightly disappointed in the big guy from Minnesota, Daniel Falalele. I think
were you disappointed, or did he kind of?
Well, I think
because we mentioned that he's too slow and too big to play tackle.
Yeah, I think that was the thing, is he kind of showed that he's not going to be a guy that can play tackle probably in the NFL unless he's playing in a scheme like you see with like what the Ravens run. Like, that's going to be a classic Ravens pick, right? Like, he's going to go in the second round to them or third round to them, like, and everybody's gonna be like, oh, he fell to the third round, and now he's a Pro Bowl right tackle, road grading for Lamar Jackson.
Right.
But I don't think you could have him block for like a Patrick Mahomes or a Kyler Murray or even like a Baker Mayfield, guys that need that actual pocket protection, right? Like, he's gonna seed too quickly, too often. I think
you can put him in a power run game at right tackle. And I think of like Phil Lodeholt, who played for the Vikings. He was massive like that and couldn't move too much. And then you think of a guy, and Fa'alele is even bigger than these guys that I'm mentioning. But you think of Eric Flowers, who got drafted to play left tackle, and he couldn't move out there, so they had to move him inside to guard. The problem with moving a guy inside like that to guard, he's 6'8" plus, and if you have a quarterback like Baker Mayfield or Kyler Murray, he cannot see the field anymore. And you have to have Josh Allen, frankly, to have anybody with even a chance to see the field when you have a guard who's like 6'8" or 6'9". It's not something that happens very often. I think of Alex Boone. He was like 6'7" or 6'8" playing guard, but it's pretty rare, and you have to have a quarterback who is taller than some of the guys that we've talked about.
What did you think, Justin? I never even got to ask you what you thought of the kid out of Central Michigan, Bernard Raymond. I was underwhelmed by him as well.
Yeah, Raymond, I thought, is a player who was getting over mocked in the mock drafts. And I think Senior Bowl performance did not do anything to sway me off of that. I don't think he has, he's been billed as like this great athlete because, they tend to do that when players are coming from another country and they've grown up with a sports background in different sports. Fa'alele is another example of that. But I wasn't impressed with his athleticism and the fact that he's 25 years old, going to be 25 years old as a rookie. I think that raises additional concerns because now you're talking about somebody who's not really like in at the age where they're still growing as far as athleticism. They're kind of at the point where they're starting to plateau.
What about the defensive interior? Who were, like, you've got some good guys on the line, but on the defensive side of the ball, who really stood out during the weekend of the game?
Oklahoma defensive lineman Perrion Winfrey was dominant, I thought, throughout the week of practice. And in the game, he had 2 sacks. He was named the player of the game overall. So I don't think you'll catch anybody who watched practice, whether they were there in person, whether they watched the practice film, or whether they only watched, ESPN and the game itself. Everybody's going to be raving about Perrion Winfrey. And part of that's because for the last couple of years, we've been looking for a defensive tackle who can actually put pressure on the quarterback. But Winfrey looks legitimately like that type of player. He's a JUCO guy. So we don't have a lot of background on him from athletic testing standpoint. So right now, that's kind of what's standing in between Winfrey and being a surefire first rounder, because at the Senior Bowl, he was completely dominant. Nobody could block him. Some guys had better reps against him than others, but nobody could really stop him.
I thought Travis Jones showed out well. He's going to be an interesting guy because he's a nose tackle. There's a couple nose tackles in this draft, which is interesting because you have obviously Jordan Davis, who's not at the Senior Bowl, but then you have Travis Jones, who was there, the UConn prospect. I thought he was great. He's a guy that Justin and I talk about all the time, right? Like, he's a guy that people are like, if he could just rush the passer, he'd be a top 5 player. And it's like, well, there's a reason that he is not a top 5 player, and it's because he can't rush the passer. But it doesn't mean he's not a useful player who can, be a true two-gapping nose in a 34 defense and really give, open up things for the linebackers in that defense. I thought Devontae Wyatt had a good week again. He's a guy that's going to be interesting to watch. Was he a 5th-year guy, Justin?
I don't think he was 5th, but he was definitely a senior. And you're always kind of cautious about, I think as a scout, as a draftnik, that the best guys declare early. So you have to remember that. Now, guys can have great senior years, like Joe Burrow, for example. But, Wyatt was a player who doesn't really emerge, kind of burst onto the scene until he's a senior. And he's surrounded by all these other great defensive players for Georgia who are going to go early too. But I agree with you. I think Wyatt, and we loved him during the season. He was our defensive lineman of the year as far as interior lineman. And I thought he had a great week too. I want to go back to Jones for a sec, because the nose tackle, there's a role for a run stopper, for a facilitator, but the question always is how valuable is that role?
I think it's outside of the top 90, but I think from his actual game and what he does, I don't know how far off he is from Jordan Davis, if that makes sense.
Right. That's kind of one of those value arguments. Why take Jordan Davis top 25 when you can take Jones at 90 or 85? Right,
and that's where I think he would go and fit. So those are the things with him that would make sense to me. But yeah, I thought Wyatt and Jones both played well this week. Like you said, they've got question marks that they have to answer, but nothing where you're like, oh, they're not draftable or things of that nature.
I'll throw out another name, Eric Johnson. He was at the NFLPA Collegiate Bowl. He got they had a pipeline to the Senior Bowl this year because the scheduling worked out better than Shrine to Senior Bowl. So Eric Johnson from Missouri State, an FCS player, basically I'm pretty sure he was a nose tackle there because you don't have the any kind of pass rushing production. But he was a player who came in, I think, 6'4", around 305 pounds or so. But he looked like he could get a little pressure on the quarterback. So goes from NFLPA, goes to the Senior Bowl, has good weeks at both places. It's going to be interesting if he gets a combine invite to see how he tests out.
Who are the guys that showed who they were? Who are the guys that might have hurt themselves a little bit?
I was a little bit player that Seth and I have talked about since before the season is Logan Hall, the defensive lineman from Houston. And they had a defensive end kind of shoot up draft boards last year and go first round in Peyton Turner. So people were looking at Hall to see, is he going to be this year's Turner? Is he going to fly up the boards in the first round? And I think he's a guy that Dane Brugler from The Athletic had in the top 50. And I didn't think Logan Hall really did anything last week, anything of note. Like, he looks the part. He's like 6'7", 280. And he's going to be a good athletic tester, too, because I think the GPS had him at like almost 20 miles per hour during a game this season. But he was quiet. And now I'm kind of looking, is he a tweener? Can he play edge? Because if he can't, then at 275 he's going to be light and tall and not have great leverage if he's lining up at defensive tackle. So you kind of you have a guy like that, he kind of might get pigeonholed in a certain scheme early in his career until he fills out his frame or develops, some pass rushing ability.
It's coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's hit the pass rushers. Are there guys worth? Is this a good edge group, at least among the seniors? And what about the off the ball guy? That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web, talking pass rushers, talking off the ball guys, and I know Seth and I really hope that the Cardinals try to avoid the off the ball guys. Draft them day 3, but whatever. But quit looking at them for top prospects. We're done with that.
So let's kind of breeze over off the ball guys, because I don't think it's a good showcase for them anyway. In the game it's pretty good. So I'll mention the one guy who I like, who was in that off the ball linebacker group, and that's Darren Beavers from Cincinnati. And he's a player who's big enough that he can get some edge reps, and he's also a player that's intriguing because he was running and covering with some of the tight ends and running backs there, even as a big dude. So he's a player, I think his season even kind of overshadowed his more heralded teammate, Myjai Sanders. And then he came in bigger than Sanders too. So Darian Beavers, I'm sorry, I think Zaven Collins, a player who can give you something off the edge if you let him, but who's going to be more comfortable off the ball, but a guy who makes plays, and a guy who's coming from the group of 5, so he might take a little bit of time to come along. But that was one of the players in the linebacking core that I liked. The other guys did okay, but it's tough because they're putting these guys like in one-on-one pass coverage drills against faster players, and they're just not going to look great. And how often is a linebacker going to be covering 30 yards downfield? They're going to be handing that guy off to a defensive back.
I thought during the game, Jojo Doman, or during the week, and then during the game, Jojo Doman was pretty good. He's a coverage guy, and he's a guy I think kind of fits into what a lot of NFL teams are looking for right now. That athletic, savvy inside linebacker that can run with these new tight ends or chase down, Kyler Murray type players. I think he's gonna be a day 3 guy.
He is, because he's 25.
Yeah, that's what I thought. He was older, right?
But he'll fit right in. He'll enjoy the same type of music and movies that the veterans do. So he's a good glue guy.
But he had a nice week and showed that he's ready to play. I think the biggest thing with him is he's got some injury issues, and like you said, there's a reason that he's a 6-year senior. But he's a guy that, like just you were saying, like if you get him in round 4 or 5, he's a guy that is going to surprise you because he's going to be able to contribute. The other guy that, again, it's really hard during this week because the drills themselves don't really speak to these guys being able to show out what they can do. But I didn't think Demarco Jackson was too bad from Appalachian State. The question you're going to have with him is can he play, every down? Because he's a smaller guy. Now, he measured in a little bit heavier than what he played at, but I worry that he gained weight, for the Senior Bowl, and is going to kind of continue to gain weight for the process.
He's like a throwback because he's short and he's like a fire plug. So he's like an old late 80s, early 90s, like middle linebacker. So those players, they're not for everybody. You mentioned a guy like Doman who he can line up over a slot. He can cover a little bit. But I think you're kind of, with Jackson, you kind of have a singular role for him. And then
Right.
Bowman's going to give you more on special teams too because he's got better speed.
Right.
Yeah. So he's kind of Jackson's kind of a relic of the past, and it's a player who could be like a stopgap kind of spot starter for you. But I don't think he's going to be. I think he'll be late, like 7th round. I think both those guys actually will go real late, maybe undrafted. Well, let's talk about the edge because I think you kind of hit it, Jess. This is a good edge class, and the top names are going to be Kayvon Thibodeau and Aiden Hutchinson and George Karlaftis. These guys weren't there at the Senior Bowl. Thibodeau, of course, underclassman. I think Karlaftis is too. But they had some players, some guys that could. But Sam Williams came from the NFLPA Bowl to the Senior Bowl as well. He's 6'4" and like 250, and he was second in the SEC in sacks behind Will Anderson. And I thought, why is this guy at the NFLPA Bowl? Well, he was arrested and charged with, I believe, sexual assault before the 2020 season. He was kicked off of the Ole Miss team, and then the charges ended up being dismissed or dropped in some way. They did enough homework. They decided he was reinstated onto the team. He finished second in the SEC this year in sacks. No further incidents coming in 2020 or 2021. That's going to be a big issue for him. Like, he's going to have to make sure teams really believe in him and his side of things. But ultimately, I think some NFL teams are warming up to him because they did invite him to move on from the NFLPA to the Senior Bowl last week, and he didn't miss a beat. He's going to be, if you're just judging him on the field, and you know, I personally don't know any details about his situation other than what's been reported. If you're just judging him on the field, he's a heck of a player. And then you got Boye Mafe from Minnesota. This is a guy Seth's been real high on all year. He's going to be an athletic freak. He had an excellent week of practice, and then he had a dominant game. I think he had 2 sacks. He was named his team's player of the game. So they have Perry Winfrey, who's like the overall player of the game. Then Boye Mafe was his team's player of the game. But he had a fantastic week. Some people think he's going to move into the first round now. And then Jermaine Johnson from Florida State, another player that the Shrine Bowl tried to get him. The Senior Bowl ends up taking him away. And Jermaine Johnson, he was outstanding too, especially that first day of practice. Like, nobody could stop Jermaine Johnson on day one.
Yeah, this edge group was really good this week. I thought Cameron Thomas from San Diego State had a good week. Kingsley Inagbare had a good week as well. You hit on the guys that were kind of the home runs, though, right? Like Jermaine, Boy, those guys, man, they just look different than the rest of these guys, right? Like, and then the last guy that I thought had some good reps, and he's going to be an interesting one because we've seen him mocked everywhere from the first round to like the middle to late second round, is Arnold Ebiketie, a guy that we talked about on our Patreon episode, a Penn State guy that transferred from Temple, kind of ran the gamut of numbers. And then, those Penn State guys are going to put up freak combine numbers. So, Ebiketie was another guy that this week, I thought you saw the kind of flaws with him, if you will, in that he's unrefined, but he's a pretty twitched up athlete with some good length on him. If you get him at the right spot, it feels like he's going to be a guy that has a good career.
Yeah, you've got kind of second or even third tier type of defensive end prospect here with Ebiketie and Myjai Sanders and Jesse Luketa. These guys are going to go day 2, early to mid day 2, all the way into the 4th and 5th round. You're going to have some of these guys. Tyreek Smith from Ohio State was there too. All of these players have a role at the next level, and so you have just looking at the seniors, you have a really good deep group And then so when you add those underclassmen that you know are going to go in the first round, it shapes up to be a good class. So last year we talked about the edge class, and we were like, where are the edge players? And you had to do a lot of projection with Odafe Owe, for example, or even Jalen Phillips, who had a great year for Miami. But you had Kwity Paye, you had some guys who were decent, but nobody that was going to go in the top 5. And now this year you've got a couple players who might go in the top 5. Or at least in the top 10 at the edge spot. And throughout the first round, we've got a good group.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals talk about this. Let's wrap things up and talk about the defensive backs and if there's any specialists worth mentioning, them. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. The defensive backs of the Senior Bowl, corners and safeties, kind of lump all together. Who are the players that improved or if we want to talk about were the risers, if any?
I'll name Jalen Petrie from Baylor. He's a defensive back, and if you look at his stats, he was like their honey badger. He had 18 tackles for loss and 3 sacks, and a few forced fumbles, 7 pass breakups, a couple picks. Like he's a guy who they're, unleashing to, he can play near the line of scrimmage, he can cover. And the thing is, he's not a big guy. He's about 5'11", kind of short armed, about 196, just sub 200 pounds, but he's such a playmaker. And then you get him in this setting, and that's what he keeps doing. He's making plays. He's covering tight ends. He's covering receivers. I've seen him listed at corner. He might get a look at corner. But what he's going to do is he's going to play safety or nickel, and he's a player who can move around the defensive backfield and just let this guy make plays. We see players like this really excel in the Senior Bowl, and then it can be to mixed results when they get to the league. Jimmy Ward was like this, and then maybe he had a slow start to his career, but he's become a pretty good player. And Richie Grant last year, he's kind of like this. He didn't have a great rookie year. Maybe he's going to come along now for Atlanta in his second year. So what happens with a guy like Petrie? He's a really good player. He gets in the Senior Bowl setting and then almost gets overvalued because, you have to look. This is a guy who's not 6 feet, not 200 pounds, short arms, kind of a vagabond, a guy without a position, but he is a playmaker. So don't overvalue this guy if you want him to play corner or if you want to play deep safety. But if you're willing to kind of have a role for him, and you can get him on day 2, then he's going to be a really good player. That's a guy who really stood out to me during the practices and in the game too.
A guy Justin mentioned on the podcast, Tariq Woolen, had a good week, and he's kind of on the opposite end, right, of the spectrum from Petrie.
Yeah, 6'3", 205.
He's the prototype wanted cornerback, big, long, but he showed good fluidness, which is, I think, the most important thing for a guy, an athlete like Woolen, size-wise. That's always the bugaboo with these big guys, is that they can't turn and move smoothly. And I think we saw it with Kevin King for the Packers. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I think Woolen did a nice job this week of showing that he has that ability.
And he was the fastest guy there as far as on the field GPS speed. He ran over 22 miles per hour on the field. So that they're saying he's going to have sub 4.4 speed at that size. He's a former receiver. The only thing is, you got to keep in mind this guy's raw, and he's only played 2 years at corner. So if you looked at the practice tape, there were some rough reps out there too.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And even somewhere I thought he does kind of look like Kevin King. I remember back on the old show, I think it was, where you said that Kevin King looked like a baby deer running, and I do agree with you that Woolen is more fluid, but King was a more experienced defensive back with a little bit more on the ball production to his name. So I do think they're kind of comparable as prospects.
Other guys, maybe just showed who they were, and others who hurt themselves a little, or maybe didn't match up to what maybe their hype was.
I really like Cincinnati's Kobe Bryant, and Sauce Gardner gets the hype from Cincinnati, but I think Kobe Bryant was a player that he won the Thorpe Award, so it's not like he's not getting any kind of recognition. So he played really well, I thought, especially on the first day of practice, where he just really shows a lot of patience, and he wasn't falling into the trap of those Senior Bowl routes, the ones that have a million steps until you get open. Kobe Bryant was just sitting there waiting and just playing the receiver very well. He's got good on-ball skills. He's got good size. I liked him. He's going to be a player who's going to present like good value because there's going to be bigger name corners that go ahead of him, and he's a guy who probably get on I don't know, what do you think, Seth? Day 2, maybe 3rd round, and you're going to have a good player.
Yeah, I liked what I saw from Bryant. He seems. The thing that I'm learning more and more as I do this is when you talk about positional guys, one of the things that you need to see from corners is the ability to move laterally, and that may seem like a duh statement, but what I mean by that is, like, can these guys rotate their hips and get to somebody on a second move? And that's where you have to see them, so often, and where you don't find these athletes. And so that's why a guy like Roger McCreary, even though I think there are some legitimate concerns from his size and length perspective, his fluidness as an athlete was on display at the Senior Bowl, and his ability to mirror and match was pretty good. And we've seen these Auburn guys are pretty, I don't want to say NFL ready, but they're pretty good NFL corners.
Yeah, you mentioned McCreary's length, and that was something we talked about on our show last week with the measurables, because you're going to see a corner with sub 31-inch arms, as McCreary does have. He's 5'11", he's not short, but with the sub 31-inch arms, a lot of teams are going to project him to the nickel.
Slot.
They're not even going to put him outside and give him that shot. So, but then you look, you don't want to make these kind of comparisons off the cuff, but Jason Barrett, he was a first-round pick. He turned out to be a pretty good player. He's even shorter at 5'9", but again with sub 30-inch or sub 31-inch arms, but he ends up being able to make it work. So it's not that it can't work, but you do wonder how many teams, for example, Seahawks traditionally are looking for corners with 32-inch arms. And so a guy like McCreary is not even going to be in consideration for them early in the draft. So, that McCreary is a player who, if you were just basing things off of the weigh-in, you'd be disappointed. But then he had a great week of practice. So now it's going to be, again, not to harp on this, but you're missing a lot of the top prospects in the draft at this game. It's good to see a guy hang with the guys that were there, though.
Are there any specialists worth even discussing?
Just from a special teams kick return standpoint, they had Calvin Austin, who can return punts and kicks, and Jaquiz Ezzard, who came from Sam Houston State, and he was another guy who got a call up from the NFLPA Collegiate Bowl. So the thing about both those guys, they're small, but they have 4.3 speed, and they have 40-inch verticals, so a lot of explosiveness in the lower body. So that's going to go to the acceleration aspect. And I guess from a kicking standpoint, the best kicker they had there was a guy named Cameron Dicker. So anybody who wants to draft a Dicker the kicker, which I'm sure the broadcast team has made that joke a million times, but that's the guy. I think he's out of Texas, and that's a player that if you're he kicked and punted this year. So Dicker the kicker.
Yeah, and the Penn State punter Jordan Stout wasn't bad either, and he's like he averaged over 46 yards a punt at Penn State his final year. So, and then he also did the kicking. So yeah, I mean they're coming, the two-way versatile guys. So you only have to keep one on your roster.
That would be the dream.
But then who holds?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
You got to make Colt McCoy do it. You got to teach these backups to hold again.
Or get the what about the slot receiver? Get the slot receiver. Didn't Bama have a slot receiver holding for them?
Exactly, and they're the best.
Excellent, guys. Hey, we I think we hit the 90-minute mark. So this is not just the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. It became the best hour and a half of Cardinals talk on the web. So with that, this supersized episode where you heard a lot of Seth and Justin and very little of me, which is, to be honest, when it comes to draft content, it's better that way. They're the experts, and I just pay attention. I just pay attention. Big thanks to Justin Higdon from the original Draft Breakdown podcast. Make sure you catch him and Seth on their show. Other than that, the next time we will be back, Seth and I will be back next week as we'll be breaking down the positional needs that the Cardinals have as we look ahead to free agency. So on behalf of the Rise of Seathers podcast, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. A big thanks to Justin Higdon as he joins us in this episode. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise up, See Red.
Roll!